My name is Michael Strong, and I'll be discussing inter-rater reliability as it relates to observing teachers for the Teacher Incentive Allotment Program. There are 4 parts to the presentation. The first covers what we mean when we talk about reliability. The second part looks at things that may get in the way of achieving high inter-rater reliability, or IRR for short. Then we move to discuss briefly how IRR is measured, and finally we consider strategies that one may use to improve IRR. Let's start with some definitions. First off, it is important to distinguish reliability from validity, as the two are related and often confused. A simple definition of reliability is the degree to which results are consistent. This can refer to consistency across time, known as test-retest reliability, consistency across people, inter-rater reliability, or consistency across items in an instrument, referred to as internal consistency. Validity, on the other hand, describes the extent to which something is what it says it is. In our case, whether an instrument measures what it claims to measure. Validity applies to both the design of an instrument and to the methods for applying it. When we adopt a measure of teacher effectiveness, for example, we trust that it is valid, that it is a sound measure of teacher quality. We hope, of course, that the authors publish evidence of the instrument's validity so that we're not relying solely on trust. Sadly, such evidence is often missing. The same is true for information on an instrument's reliability. We can use the metaphor of shots on a target to illustrate the difference between reliability and validity. Something may produce good reliability, where the shots are in a cluster, but low validity because they miss the bullseye. They can show low reliability and validity when the shots are encircling the center, neither reliability nor validity when they're scattered above the target, and both when they group in the middle. We can see from this analogy that reliability is a necessary but not a sufficient condition for validity. Something can't be valid if it is unreliable, but reliability does not guarantee validity. For the rest of this talk, I'll be focusing on one of the 3 kinds of reliability, the one that measures consistency between and among judges. Sometimes you will come across a reference to inter-rater agreement, IRA. A measure of IRA is essentially the same as a measure of IRR. Although some researchers use IRR to measure similarity in the way individuals or things are ranked, while IRA focuses on the scores themselves. Often, IRR can refer to both kinds. We will use IRR to refer to both ranks and scores. We can think of IRR then in 3 different ways. Some researchers look to see how well raters or judges produce scores that approximate some kind of master rating. In our setting, this might happen during a training session when we're checking learners' scores against those of an expert. Sometimes we're comparing the exact ratings of 2 or more judges, while at other times we're looking for agreement simply on who is better or worse, their rankings. Now I want to move on to a discussion of some of the hurdles we face when trying to maximize agreement or consensus among raters. We can identify 3 areas where threats to reliability may be encountered: in the instrument itself, among the people doing the evaluating, the appraisers, and in the procedures the appraisers use to observe teachers, the process. First, let's consider the instrument we are using to help us observe teachers. There are very many observation instruments in existence. Some are well known and widely used, such as the Danielson Framework, the Classroom Assessment Scoring System, the TAP rubric, and more recently, the t-test. Many schools and researchers have developed their own measures. Some find reason to modify existing measures, and sometimes teachers are evaluated by a principal doing a walkthrough without the benefit of any rubric at all. One way of classifying the instruments that have been developed is by the degree of inference they require of their users. The higher the inference level, the more a rater is called upon to make their own judgment. That principal doing a walkthrough will be all judgment. In low inference instruments, raters simply record whether or not they have observed a particular behavior. Here are two examples from rubrics, one high inference and one low inference. You can see that the more the observer is simply checking for empirical evidence of something they can count, the lower the level of inference. Other barriers to IRR occur when items in the rubric lack specificity in some way, making them unclear and difficult to score. They may be ambiguous or vague, differentially weighted, or poorly defined, or not defined at all. On this slide, I've listed a few examples that decrease clarity and subsequently threaten IRR. Certain descriptors and concepts may mean different things to different people. And when there's more than one thing to judge within one cell, it can lead to confusion about how to score it. I'll leave you a few moments to read through these examples. The more teaching behaviors are to be scored on the rubric, the more likelihood that some will sometimes not occur in a given lesson. This may be because they fall outside the teacher's repertoire, or because they simply were not called for on that particular occasion. Some instruments have a provision for scoring not observed as a way of not penalizing the teacher. Otherwise, it must be assumed that all behaviors to be rated should occur in every lesson. This example describes an attribute that may not always be observable in every lesson. If a score for this attribute is required, it may be necessary for the observer to consult with the teacher in advance to adjust their lesson plan so that the target behavior would be expected to occur and then may be scored. I'll give you a few seconds to read the example. Another threat to IRR relates to the cognitive load that the process places on the observer. The most common form of this occurs when the instrument has more items for an appraiser to rate than they can hold in their memory. This may be a problem for those using Danielson's framework. In a famous article on information processing capacity, the English psychologist George Miller suggested back in the 1950s that the magical number for holding items in short-term memory is 7 plus or minus 2. Danielson's framework severely challenges that capacity, as do many other observation instruments. Whether the magical number is actually 7 or whether there is any magical number at all, the point is that our capacity for processing information is limited, and most instruments strain that capacity, which in turn threatens IRR. If your instrument does include many items, it might be wise to break it down, say into domains, and rate different domains on different occasions. Another source of reliability problems stems from the appraisers themselves. For example, they may have differential experience with the instrument. This can be addressed by making sure all appraisers are trained similarly and recalibrated regularly. A big issue for all raters, who are human, concerns bias. This may manifest itself in many ways, from biases about people, about the way teachers should conduct themselves, about teaching practices, about how a classroom should be decorated, or about what they already know or have heard about the teacher. There are several steps one can take to combat potential biases. Bias training can be incorporated into the training to use the instrument. Bias can also be offset by having appraisers work together and defend their scores to one another. It is also sometimes better to use an appraiser that is a stranger to the target teacher. Rating mistakes can also occur because the appraiser gets tired or is distracted for some reason. This can be addressed by having shorter and fewer appraisals and by using video so that the appraiser can hit pause if necessary. Another problem occurs when, after a time, an appraiser begins to drift away from their calibrated practice, becoming sometimes increasingly more generous or more punitive in their scoring. This can be addressed by periodic calibration sessions. I have already mentioned the importance of adequate training to use the instrument. Most evaluation tools require several days for training and for trainees to practice using the instrument before appraisers can go and do their work. Usually this involves calibrating their practice scores against some sort of expert ratings until the trainer is confident that the appraisers fully understand the process. To skimp on training is to face serious problems with IRR. Another problem is that appraisers may produce different scores for the same teacher when they view different lessons, as not all behaviors appear in every lesson. Lessons may differ radically, and teacher performance is not always perfectly stable. Best is for appraisers to view the same lesson, preferably using video. Otherwise, the more lessons viewed of a teacher, the more likely the average ratings will be reliable. If an appraiser has observed a given teacher before, this may affect their scoring on subsequent occasions, causing their scores to vary from an appraiser who's observing that teacher for the first time. In order to avoid this, appraisers should preferably have similar experience observing a given teacher. Again, video is helpful here. Next, I want to mention briefly how indicators of inter-rater reliability are measured. Depending on whether you are an instrument developer, a researcher, or a practitioner, you may use a different statistical method for determining IRR. Some methods are more sophisticated than others, and statisticians, like economists, rarely agree on the best procedure. Some of the most common measures of IRR you will come across in the literature include simple percent agreement and different kinds of correlation coefficients, some correcting for chance agreements and some not. Most frequently used are Cohen's kappa and intra-class correlation, or ICC. My own personal preference is for ICC. I won't go into any more detail here, as my emphasis is on offering ways for improving IRR, not for ways to measure it. I want to stress, however, that there is no consensus on what makes for a good or acceptable reliability coefficient. My best advice is to do everything you can to improve IRR. Pick a method you can live with and justify it. And finally, somewhat of a summary recap of things that we can do to improve IRR. We can separate the improvements to things before, during, and after observing a teacher. One of the most important of all is to provide thorough and quality training to the appraisers. This includes introduction to the use of the instrument, how to define descriptors that may be ambiguous, and bias awareness training. Also in place before any appraisals begin, observers should be provided with operational definitions of all technical terms that may mean different things to different educators. Following training, or really as part of it, there should be ample practice sessions using videos and comparing scores with expert ratings. Part and parcel of the bias and reliability training should be pair work, where appraisers have to defend their scores and decisions to a partner, discuss, possibly change, and then report out. To improve reliability during appraisals, I recommend using video and setting some guidelines as to what should be included in an observed lesson, such as a teacher introducing new material or reviewing a unit. Lastly, as a way to keep appraisers from scoring drift, it is a good idea to do some periodic monitoring and recalibration. So that's about all I want to cover in my part of the session on inter-rater reliability. I welcome questions after the session is over. My contact information is here. Thanks for your attention.